Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Ich dank dir Gott für all Wohltat, which translates to I thank you God for all kindness. This chorale has a lot going on in it. I mean, if you look at the form, it's a relatively short chorale. I'd say it's on like the short mid-size side of real estate occupation on the page, but we have a lot of individual phrases that consist of these 4-beat chunks. So there's a lot of cadences in this chorale proportionate to its length, which is a visual standout characteristic. All in all, the harmony is fairly straightforward, but we do have some unique points that are worth talking about from the very beginning all the way to the end. So I'm excited to analyze this chorale with you all. Let's hop into it. So we have no key signature. We start with C major. We end with C major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is C major. However, the opening phrase is amongst the more interesting aspects of this chorale. We actually end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G. Now, the main reason why I'm not analyzing the beginning in the key of G major has to do with this F natural here. If this were an F sharp, I'd have really no leg to stand on here in terms of analyzing this phrase and what it could potentially be in. But when I hear C major first, going to this B flat, going down, and then we hear F sharp at the same time, I'd be thinking sort of in G minor terms. But with this F natural, it really does feel like C is just moving normally in the key of C major until we get to a chord here, which is particularly unusual. So we start off with a 1 chord, passing tone in the tenor, and then we get B flat, G, C, and E, which is C7 over B flat. Now this is a secondary dominant chord, more specifically 5/4-2 of 4, because C also happens to be the dominant of F major, and that's where we would expect this to resolve to an F major chord in first inversion. But Bach throws us for a loop here. We actually get a F sharp here in the melody, and that does something similar to the chord that we saw in a chorale recently, where the chord is actually substituted for another chord with a similar triadic structure, just the root is a half step up from where we would expect to resolve. So I think actually we are modulating over a secondary dominant here. This 5/4-2 of 4 is actually also functioning as 4/4-2 in the key of G major, and 4/4-2 with the flat 7 is borrowing from the parallel minor. This is mode mixture, so the C in the key of G major is not like 7 of 7, or sorry, 5 of 7 or anything like that. I just feel like this is a very rare case where a modulation is happening over a secondary dominant. If you go back to some of my earlier videos, you'll find that modulating over the secondary dominant was a rather common occurrence, but I went back and reanalyzed, and in a lot of those cases, if I were to go back and comment on them now, I'd say that there's probably a more logical place to mark the resolution, but the modulation. But that's based on months and months of analyzing and garnering experience from it. But here is an actual case where we're modulating over a secondary dominant. In my opinion, the phrase is really short, and sort of all the stars are aligning for something like this to happen, and we're getting mode mixture, which is pretty interesting as well. So this is 4/4-2, but even on top of the fact that this is 4/4-2, this is a dominant 7 chord as a byproduct of the G melodic minor scale rather than the G major scale, where we would see B natural in the bass. So something worth noting there. And that takes us to where we actually would expect it to go, which is 7/6, A, C, and F sharp. So it's the 4/2 chord is resolving where we would expect as soon as we see the context of G minor. Of course, we could analyze this C chord as 4 as well. It's just when I hear this C major chord first, with this passing F natural here in the tenor, there's nothing really signaling to me that we're in the key of G minor. I feel like with this passing F natural, to feel valid in terms of G minor, it'd have to come from an E flat rather than an E natural. Otherwise, it has more of like a Dorian feel than a G minor feel. But I could be wrong. I think analyzing from the very beginning in the key of G major could make sense as well, depending on your relationship with the harmony and how you hear it. But this is how I hear it. So very interesting chord and definitely something worth talking about. We also cadence on our tonic. G, D, B, and G. G major in root position. Next phrase ends perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. So we go to G major again, just over B, B, G, D, and G. Just taking our G major chord and inverting it once, no need to reiterate the Roman numeral. I do think this is where we go back to the key of C major, and it's now 5-6. We then resolve the C major, C, G, C, and E. Very common for Bach to use 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads, but still our tonic is what's being implied here. We then go to 5, G, G, C, and D. Very similarly, we see a lot of 4/3 suspensions over dominant triads here, but we know that G major is being implied. F is a passing seventh, a very brief passing seventh before we go to our tonic C major. C, E, G, and C. Very low chord. All the voices are pretty much at the bottom of their ranges, respectively. Next phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G again. I do think we pretty much spend the entire phrase in G, at least after the first couple of beats. Start off with C major, C, E, G, and C, so no need to reanalyze. B, G, D, and G is 5-6, G major over B, and that takes us right back to C major, C, C, E, and G. I think this is our tonic and also our gateway to the key of G major, where it is now our 4 chord, passing 7th on the bass, and then we have A minor, or what one might, well, I'm going to phrase it this way, one might mistake for A minor, even though it's a valid analysis. It's not really a mistake, it's just not how I would analyze it. We have A, C, E, and A, but I think this E is an accented non-chord tone. This is another instance where we see 2 and 7 contextualized with one another. Whether or not this F sharp or this E is our chord tone, I think F sharp is the root of this chord here, and this is actually a 7-6 chord. It makes more sense narratively because it, would be the complement to what would otherwise be a non-normative progression. If this was 4 going to 2, you could make the argument this is a 2 to 7 progression if you feel like only one voice needs to move in order to constitute a chord progression. But for me, I feel like at least 2 voices need to move. That's not a rule, it's just an observation. So I don't know. I mean, I think there are multiple ways to analyze stuff like this. I'm not 100% certain on it, but this is the way that I interpret the harmony, and I feel like this is the most elegant chord progression that can be extrapolated from the texture, and definitely feels like what's happening narratively speaking. And we would expect this to resolve to 1, which it does. G, D, G, and B. G major, root position. Closing in on our cadence here, we have E, C, G, and C. That's our 4 chord in first inversion, C major over E, neighbor tone here in the alto before we get D, D, G, and B. This is G major over D. It's been a while since we've seen a 1-6-4 chord on the channel. But then another interesting talking point is that we would typically expect 5 after a 1-6-4 chord, but here we have a case of an interrupted 1-6-4. That's what I've been calling it. I'm not sure if there's another term for it, but sometimes Bach takes a 1-6-4 chord and interrupts it with another chord. In this case, we have C. Sorry, I almost marked them with parentheses because it felt like it was felt like they were like neighbor tones or whatever. Neighbor tones or anticipations, but here we have C, E, G, and A, which is A minor 7 flat, just A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts, but typically 1-6-4s are predominant. Here we're doubling up on predominance here, which is interesting. And then we have 5, D, D, G, and A, again with the 4-3 suspension over the dominant. Use a dashed bracket for interrupted 1, 6, 4, 5 progressions. A little delayed passing 7th here as well in the tenor before we cadence on G major. G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, moving ahead to our next phrase, we're going back to the idea of short phrases following one after the other. This is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, but I think we start in the key of C major. So even though there's a gap here, you could make the argument we have a direct modulation to C major. I think that's totally valid because typically when a gap like this exists, it does feel like that. But when I hear G major going to C major, I hear 5 going to 1, so I feel like G's a 5. And then we get not 1, but I guess the gap sort of makes this 1-6 feel more like, it makes 5-1 progression feel more distant because it's not the root movement or the bass movement that we would expect. It's moving up a 6th rather than moving up a 4th. But 5 going to 1-6, that takes us to D minor, F, C, E, and A. I suppose you can make an argument this is 4-7, but I think this E is a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and this is actually D minor 7 over F, which is 2-6-5. I'm actually going to remove this parenthetical analysis because I don't have enough space underneath, but you could analyze this as a 4-7 chord if you wanted. The tones are there and the function is basically identical. But I think this is our gateway to the key of A minor. Kind of interesting to see a 4-6-5 chord. We have seen them in the past, but they're relatively uncommon. 4-6-5 takes us to G sharp, B, D, and B. I think this is a root position 7 chord. 4 typically goes to 7, but with this E sort of in the fold as well, you could make an argument this is a 5-6-5 chord. But again, 4-7 versus 2-6-5, 7 versus 5-6-5, they're basically identical chords for all intents and purposes. They both would resolve the way that we would expect. A, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Afterwards, we have a half cadence in the key of D minor, and I think, there's an argument to be made that we start off in the key of F major with C major going to F major here. Kind of in a similar fashion to the previous phrase where we start in the key of C and then move to the relative minor, and I'm actually inclined to say that that's what's happening here as well. However, via the cycle of falling fifths, 3 still wants to go to 6, but I think there is some symmetry going on between these phrases, so I'm going to say in the, am I going to say that? I'm not 100% certain if I feel that way. In my analysis I have this, I have C major being 3 in the key of A minor, and then we have F, which is 6. C major being C, E, C, and G, and F major being F, F, C, and A. And I suppose the argument for F major is a little less viable because of B natural happening here. We sort of have this ascending chromatic line here in the alto that is pointing towards D, which is our eventual target. So I'm going to say that staying in the key of A minor here is probably a safer bet for the same reason why analyzing this whole phrase in the key of G major here at the beginning is a little harder to argue because of this F natural. Even though this sounds like a 5-1 in the key of F, that's coincidental because we're also in the key of A minor, and I've sort of just further convinced myself that that's the case. But regardless, 6 is going to end up being our gateway to the key of D minor. It's also going to be our 3 chord. And then we have an interesting chord here as well. We have F, we have G, we have C, and we have G, this F being a lower suspension, and also by association, this C natural being accented non-chord tone as well, where we have E, G, C sharp, and G. Bit of transitive harmony here. This is 7-6 following a 3 chord. Typically it's the other way around, but we do see this all the time. Transitive harmony where Bach uses voice leading that goes against the normative grain of the falling fifth and uses the same to go in reverse. And in this case, we see 3 going to 7, 7 functioning as a dominant. We would expect this to resolve to 1, which it does. D, A, D, and F. Tonic triad, root position, passing tone in the bass, neighbor tone in the alto, takes us to 1, 6, F, A, D, and F. D here briefly puts us back in root position, so I could just write that there. It's not often where Bach reiterates a chord and we have all of the tones intact, so I keep note of that in my analysis when that happens. And our half cadence concludes with 5, A major with this 4-3 suspension over the bass, A, C sharp, and E. Moving ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, and this gap here illustrating a point in which we have a direct modulation. I feel like the cross relationship between C sharp and C natural makes these two phrases feel separate from one another, even though C major is diatonic to the key of D minor. Just the context in which the two chords are being voiced feels separate. You know, it's a little bit of a double standard because 7 goes to 5 with some frequency, but 5 doesn't really go to 7, the subtonic 7th, that is. So when it goes one way, my brain doesn't feel like the chords are connected, but when it goes the other way, there's an argument to be made that the chords are connected. So it's a relatively uncommon chord progression, 7 going to 5, but we do see it from time to time. But 5 going to 7, we don't see that chord progression happen within the key. I don't think we've ever seen it. So I think it's safe to say that these feel like separate phrases. So we're going to start off with C major over E, just like how we started 2 phrases ago. E, C, G, and C. Tonic triad, first inversion. And that's going to take us to F, F, C, G, and A. You could even make the argument this is a beyond a 4 chord, a 4-4-2 chord, because of the fact that by the time the F gets introduced after this 9/8 suspension, we have a passing 7th in the bass, but I'm just going to mark them as passing and neighboring 7ths respectively. It doesn't really make too much of a difference, even though it does resolve the way we would expect. I feel like this is more contrapuntal than anything else. We see these situations where the 7th could potentially be the base of the chord as well. I don't think it makes too much of a difference analytically. It's coincidental that it resolves the way that we expect. We see this passing 7th resolve to a first inversion triad all the time. In this case, it's a 7 chord in first inversion, which we would expect to follow a 4 chord. D, D, F, and B natural. And that takes us to C major. C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase takes us back to the key of D minor, ends in a half cadence similar to the phrase that we previously analyzed, or before the one we just analyzed. We start off with D minor. D, D, F, and A. You could analyze this as a direct modulation. I hear it as 2. You could then say that this is our tonic triad now in the key of D minor, passing 7th in the tenor. And then we have D, B flat, E, and G. You could make the argument this is a 2-4-2 chord, E minor 7 flat 5 over D. However, it doesn't quite fully resolved that way, so this D feels more like a lower suspension, like a 9-10 suspension underneath the alto perhaps, and this actually feels more like a 7 chord, C sharp fully diminished 7th that resolves to 1, D, A, E, and F, another 9/8 suspension over a tonic triad, or the base of a tonic triad, and our half cadence ends with 5, A, C sharp, and E. D being a 4-3 suspension over the dominant. So our next phrase is actually very interesting. I think there are a couple of different ways that you can go about analyzing it. I had some thoughts I was saying earlier. This is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of E minor, and I think actually in the key of E minor, A major is functioning like our major 4 chord, and even though we're not following our major 4 chord with a chord that we're used to seeing, we see a pattern here that is particularly common in Bach under other circumstances. So if we look at this A chord like our 4 chord, which under normal circumstances I wouldn't analyze it, I feel like this would feel like a direct modulation, like 2 keys that were unlike one another that didn't have a common point. But check out the chord that separates our 2 A major chords. So we have C sharp, A, E, and E here. I feel like this G is an accented 7th, or in this case kind of like a non-chord tone, but I'm going to call this 4-6. And if you see 2 chords that are 2 beats apart, or if it's subdivided 1 beat apart, but if you see a pattern like this where you see 2 chords with the same Roman numeral, one in an inversion and one not, this might remind you of a chord progression that we see involving tonic triads and 7 chords, where we have 1, 7, 6, 1. Here we often bridge the gap between 2 similar chords that are separated by an inversion with a chord that's a diatonic step below and in first inversion. So 4-6, or 4 going to 4-6, would be bridged by a 3-6 chord. And it's really interesting. This is a relatively uncommon take on that same pattern, but the only reason that makes this A major feel any more like a common chord than it does a direct modulation, something that separates itself from the key of E minor, is the fact that it's being contextualized in this way, and Bach is using that stepwise motion to bridge the gap using this pattern that's very common in Bach. But like I said, it's most common with 1 chords, but here we're seeing 4 and 3 used, the same pattern being the result. We have G major in first inversion bridging 2 A major chords. I think that's super neat. And the only reason why I feel like this A major chord is common between the key of E minor and D minor, which are distant to one another. So 4-3-6, which is B, G, D, and G, and A major again over C sharp, A, E, and E. That takes us to 5-7, D sharp, A, B, and F sharp, which is, or more specifically 5-6-5, which is B7 over D sharp. G is a non-chord tone, F sharp is a chord tone, and then we cadence on E minor, E, E, B, and G. Tonic triad, root, position. Our penultimate phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G. We start off with an E minor chord again. We have E, E, G, and C. Apologies, I tricked myself. I would have expected to see an E minor chord here, but instead we have a C major chord over E, which would be 6-6 in the key of E minor. Instead, I think in the key of G major, this is our 4-6 chord, and then we have F sharp, D, and A. Along with that C is a 5-6-5 chord, so 4-6 going to 5-6-5, very common subdivided chord progression. We would expect our tonic after this. G, D, A, and B, again with the 9/8 suspension over the bass, our tonic triad and root position. Then we have D, D, G, and A, another 4-3 suspension over our dominant chord, D major, root position, a little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor, and then we cadence on G, which is our tonic triad. G, B, D, and G. Our final phrase sort of harkens back to the length and just proportion of the third phrase of the chorale. It's a perfect authentic cadence at the end of it in C major, and we pretty much spend the entire time in C major. We start off with G major over B, B, G, D, and G, which is just taking G major and putting it in first inversion, and I do believe it becomes our 5-6 chord as well, because G is also our dominant in the key of C, and it resolves the way we would expect. C, G, C, and E, tonic triad, root position, passing tones in the outer voices before we get E, C, C, and G. And sure enough, with this passing B flat here, you probably already know what I'm going to say if you've watched my videos in the past. Most likely this is functioning like 5-6 of 4, because the B flat is, it's insinuating that it's going to resolve to our 4 chord, because our tonic can also be the dominant of the subdominant with the proper context. We see 1 go to 4 all the time, but we don't always see the B flat as a passing tone or some type of contextual tone that brings us to 4, which makes us change the analysis potentially. You also could just analyze it as 1 and just view that B flat as a chromatic passing tone. But afterwards, it does take us to 2-4, F, A, C, and A. So it resolves the way we would expect. Passing tones here in the inner voice, or we have a passing tone in the tenor, a delayed one, and F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And that takes us to, again, another potentially 5 of 4 chord, because it looks like C, 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 F, and G, 4-3 suspension over a dominant functioning chord. So it's cool that a secondary dominant's also getting a 4-3 suspension in it, kind of affirming what Bach already does a lot in his own writing. But this is where it gets really interesting, because we don't get a progression that we would expect. We actually get a secondary deceptive progression. Instead of going to 4, we go to 2-4-2, C, A, D, and F. This is an example of what I've been calling a secondary deceptive progression. In the key of F major, if we see a C major chord, we would expect it to resolve to F, but in this case it's going to D minor. In the key of C major, D minor is our 2 chord, but in the key of F major, D minor is our 6 chord. So that's what I mean by secondary deceptive. In a roundabout way, the chord is going where in the key of F major we would call it deceptive progression, or if we cadenced on it, a deceptive cadence. But instead we're going to 2-4-2, and this is another case of a 4-2 chord resolving the way we would expect to a 5-6 chord. B, G, D, and F. More specifically 5-6-5, but still a first inversion 5 chord, and then we go to C major. C, G, D, and E, but this D is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. We know that Bach likes 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads especially. We then have F, A, C, and D, which is 2-6-5. Again, Bach loves 2-6-5 chords in cadential contexts especially. B is a passing tone, A is a chord tone, D is a chord tone. We then expect this to go to 5, which it does. G, G, D, B and D, G major in root position, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on C major. C, E, G, and C. Another one of these low C major chords, kind of like the second phrase here. And that is today's analysis. All in all, how straightforward is this chorale? I would say it's medium straightforward. You know, there are some points that are up for debate, you know, whether or not we have direct modulations happening, where modulations are happening, whether or not we start in C major, if we start in G major. I think there's some points for debate, up for debate in this particular analysis, but for me, I'm really happy with the analysis that I produced because it's very succinct and gets to the point. We also have some interesting takeaways, you know, secondary deceptive progressions like we have here at the end, modulating over a secondary dominant, an interrupted 2-4 or a 1-6-4 to 5 progression, mode mixture here at the beginning of the chorale as well, a distant modulation from D minor to E minor. Lots to talk about in this particular chorale that makes it feel distinct, makes it feel like it has its own unique profile. Not sure if we've seen a chorale that has all these combinations of attributes, but we see it here, and it was a really fascinating chorale to analyze. But I think I'm going to cap the video off on that thought. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so as well. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.